This is an adjustable height work support. It was designed by John Nyquist, and he used it primarily for his chairs. Now, if you don't know John, he's a contemporary of Sam Maloof. They made kind of similar looking chairs. John came up with this because he wanted something that he could put a chair on top of, so it's relatively narrow. He wanted to be able to adjust the height because he did a lot of what he called noodling on it, shaping and sculpting, things like that. And it's pretty stable. It's a relatively hefty piece of equipment here. So when I was teaching during the summer, I taught a class where students made this. And more recently, I've had people ask for a video on how to do it. So I'm going to walk through that process, probably be several parts. It's a great project. It's a little challenging. As is usual with most projects, there are tips and tricks for various parts of it. The material is soft maple. That's what John recommended. It's relatively inexpensive, easy to work, and it just seems to work out really well for this. Of course, you could use any material. I would avoid using something pretty heavy or difficult to work. Poplar might work fine also. So anyway, I've got, as you can see here, I've got some soft maple. The height is adjusted by loosening these knobs, and I'd like to put my foot under here to kind of hold it up in case it wants to fall. And then I can lower it. So as low as it goes is about the height of my table saw. Comes up pretty high. I'm not sure how high that is, maybe 4 feet. At school, when we had these, they were often used as in-feed and out-feed tables for bandsaws and things like that, and also, of course, for work supports. At the bottom, there's a little tray here, and I typically just have shims in here because, it's typical of a shop. The floor's not perfectly flat, and it's always nice to have a shim handy to put under one of the feet. The project is primarily made of 5/4 material. So most of the cross-section is about 1 inch thick. 4/4 material, which would end up being, closer to 3/4, a little on the light side for this. This thing needs to be fairly, stable and sturdy. And then some of the parts are 6/4 material, like these pieces here for this torsion box top, and the feet are 6/4. I'm going to start, like any project, by roughing out my parts. I've got a cut list here, which is available on my website, and I'm just going to go through the typical process of roughing out lumber. The feet are 16 inches long, so I'm going to cut them 17. But first I need to clear the end of this, make sure there's no checks in here. The other 6/4 pieces are the frame member, which is the frame for the torsion box top. So I'll get 2 pieces out of here that are the full 40 inches long. This is cut to 41. The cross members are 13, so 3 of those gives me 39. So I can get 1, 2, 3 by ripping this into 3 pieces. And then I can get 3 more cross member pieces out of this one. I really only need 5, so it gives me a spare. So that's it for the 6/4 material. When I'm roughing out the parts, I use my cut list, and each part is numbered on here. So the feet are number 1, the long frame numbers are number 2, these pieces here, the short ones are here. And as I'm checking parts off, I realize I forgot the filler blocks. There's some extra pieces inside here that I'll go over later, but I was short one of those. So I've got 2 long ones, 3 short ones. I can get 2 more short ones here, and then I need 2 more, so there's actually 7 inside here. So I just grabbed a piece of, this is from a 2x4. It's going to go inside. You're not going to see it, and I should say, don't get too hung up about the parts and the sizes on this thing. Just kind of make things fit as needed. Now, the other thing I do as I'm going through my cut list, like I said, each part is numbered. So on the ends of the boards, I will write what numbers they are. So these 1s are for the feet, the 3s are the short frame numbers, the 2s are the long frame numbers. So that allows me, as I'm going through and rough milling parts and milling parts, to see until near the end what part numbers these are. So I'm going to continue on doing the same thing with all my 5/4 material, and then I'll start rough milling things down to near their finished size. I'm working through the various pieces, and I discovered I had a big chunk taken out of this piece here. So there's always going to be defects and things that you got to work around. So what I did, I'm going to get a 1x1 inch piece from here, and then a 1x4 inch piece from here. So I'll waste a little wood, there, and it turns out the 1x1 needs to be 22, so I had to start as close to the defect as I could and then come to here, and this gives me a little longer than I need for the 4-inch wide piece, but I think that's going to work out best. So, once again, you're just working around defects and doing the best you can. Okay, I've cut most of the pieces. I've got 1 piece left, and I've got a little bit of a dilemma. I need a piece of 5/4 that's 4 inches wide and 22 inches long. And I just finished cutting the last of my 5/4 material. So what I've got left is this piece, which is about 7 inches wide. This is 5/4. And it's probably about 8 feet long, and I've got a piece of 6/4 that's maybe, a little 4 feet long. This was narrower, so for a 4-inch wide piece, I'm going to have less waste here. But then I'll have no spare 6/4 material. This is the only 6/4 material I have in the shop. Whereas if I take that 22-inch piece out of this, this is about 7. I'm going to waste a fair amount of material, but I'm going to go with this because just as a backup, I'm going to save what little 6/4 material I have. Okay, I've got all my material right now just cut to length. You can see I've got all the parts labeled on here. So the next step is to start surfacing. Now, if this was a furniture project, I would typically do that in 2 steps. I'd rough mill everything, and then as I use it, I'd final mill it. And I alluded to that earlier, but I forgot. This is a fixture. I'm not as concerned about everything being perfect. So I'm just going to basically mill this stuff to its final thickness and width. Now, there are a couple pieces that guide some of the things here. So I'm going to leave those a little bit oversized because they're going to get milled to final thickness once other parts are together. So some of the stuff I'll hold off on a bit, but in general, I'm going to mill the stuff down to thickness and width. One thing that I didn't really realize when I was at the lumber yard, this stuff has been milled a little bit. It's hit or miss, which means it's been run through a planer just to, so you can see the grain on it. So these are relatively close to final thickness, particularly the 6/4 material. So I'm going to have to be careful as I'm milling it that I don't go too far and get below my dimensions. But if I do a little bit, like I said, it's a fixture, not a big deal. I'm not worried about it. I've got the parts all roughed out now, and I'm milling them to a thickness and width. So I've surfaced on the jointer one face and one edge of each part, making sure that everything's nice and straight. And next up, I'm going to do the 6/4 parts, which are going to get milled to about 1 1/4 3/8. And I'm working on the frame parts. So one thing that's really important on these parts, remember this is the frame that creates the torsion box for the top. And I want to make sure these are all square, the same size, because once I start milling, I don't want to have to worry about, is this the thickness or the width or whatever. So I want to make sure these are square, want to make sure they're straight, and I want to make sure they're all the same size. So I'm going to mill them all at the same time. I have marked on the short pieces so far, the two sides that are square to each other. And now I'm working on the longer parts. So I really want to emphasize, you want these straight, right? If these aren't straight, your top might not be straight. So I'm just, watching what I'm doing here, sighting, making sure I'm, when I'm milling it, that I've got a stable surface. I'm watching where I want to be removing material. Like if I sight down this one, I can see there's a little bit of a hollow here. So I'll put this side down and I'll be listening to see, how much of it's hitting here versus the rest of it. So really pay attention to what you're doing here. The other thing is, when you're milling a part that's square, it's not always easy to tell if you're, square up against the fence, right? Because there's the same amount of surface down on the table as there is against the fence. So as I'm milling these, once I've got a straight surface, I'm making sure that the reference surface is up against the fence. So I can't just be pushing down. I have to be pushing over too. So, is to make sure that the part is square. Because what I've seen people do is they have not paid attention to that. They have two surfaces that aren't quite square or perpendicular to each other. And then when you start milling the opposite faces in the planer, you end up with a parallelogram, or I guess technically a rhombus if it's square, but is square in terms of dimensions, but tilted. So you really want to avoid that, because that's going to cause a lot of trouble later when we're doing the joinery for that. So keep that in mind when you're doing this. To make it easier at the planer, I cut all the frame pieces to the same size, in this case just over 1 3/8. I'm done milling all the parts to thickness. So my frame parts ended up a little under 1 3/8. I was shooting for 1 3/8, but one of these long pieces ended up, because they're longer and they were slightly warped, and this was milled hit or miss at the lumber yard. I didn't have quite as much to work with as I had hoped. So I'm maybe a 1/16 on a 1 3/8, which once again isn't a big deal. What's more important is that they're all the same size and they're square. For the feet, I left those as thick as I could. Notice I've got a chunk taken out here that was just rough on the rough lumber. But the foot gets cut off there, so I've kind of been anticipating that getting cut off. The other parts, In general, I try to keep them as thick as possible, but some of the parts doesn't matter, like these pieces here, I think, and I'm always referring back to my cut list so I know which part I'm working on. So the parts that have to do with the little tray at the bottom, I'll try and show a picture of that over here. Those can be a little thinner on this one I have here. That's, I think they're actually 3/4. So that's the sides of that tray where I keep shims and things. And, you know, actually that's a little better if those are thinner. The piece that goes on the bottom of the tray, this one, you know, this had a little bark inclusion in it. I'll just put that facing down. So as you're milling the parts, just be cognizant of where they go and how important it is that they maintain thickness. You know, where you really want the thickness is in the foot and in the primary legs. That's these. These are, you know, I think 1.125 1.25 inches. Well, they were rough 1 1/4. So I think these are 1.125 inches or somewhere in that range. So these are now, all these parts are S3S'd, you know, 2 faces and an edge. What I'm going to do next is rip them on the table saw. I'll rip them about a 32nd wider than final, and then 1 run on the jointer, and they should be all ready to go. On the guides that guide the sliding leg up and down, definitely keep those a little thick, because you're going to want to mill those to fit depending on the width of the fixed leg and the sliding leg, and then these go on either side of that. So we mill these to fit after those parts are all set and ready to go. Oh, and one more thing. I wanted to show you how much waste I had. So these are all my offcuts. Pretty small, pretty rough. There were a couple of pieces where, you know, I had a little extra width, but I'd say in general that's pretty good for waste. Now I do have a couple of the rough boards with the 6/4 piece is about 4 feet long, and one of the 5/4 pieces about 6 feet long. So that's what I have left over from what I started with. I've cut all the parts to width, and now I'm just getting them set up so I can joint the ripped edge. So I'll check to see that the jointer is cutting a 32nd. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just taking a test cut, making sure that the cut matches the amount I left for extra width. So I'm going to leave it here for now, and we'll pick up next time starting the joinery.